Diablo II was released in the Wild West days of the internet. That mentality, combined with the monetary value of its in-game gear, led some players to try anything they could to get their hands on valuable items. In this video, we're going to look at some of the most devastating scams in Diablo II history. Buckle up, players. You asked for this. There have been two types of scams throughout Diablo II history. The first type that we'll talk about we'll call lowbrow scams. These are the types of scams that didn't require a lot of work or thought on behalf of the scammer and almost exclusively relied on the naive or overly trusting victim. I'd be lying if I said I didn't fall for a lowbrow scam once or twice, and maybe more, in my Diablo career, but I feel like they turned out to be good life lessons at a very young age. Like, don't trust strangers on the internet. Or when someone says they can dupe your items, there's actually a 107% chance they're trying to scam you. Lowbrow scams were all over the place in this game. I'm sure we've all seen that guy who tried swapping out an item in the trade window for one that has a similar graphic. He's hoping that the victim won't pay attention and will quickly click the accept trade button. But as any seasoned Diablo 2 player knows these days, you always pay attention in trade. This is the oldest trick in the book for a reason though, as it still gets people to this day. Or maybe you remember the various ways people tried drop trading back when you couldn't trade your anti-charms and torches. This obviously paved the way for a lot of lowbrow scamming where people would drop their charms on the ground for other items and in one way or another lose them, whether it was in Act 2 or it was a result of someone using a town teleport program to quickly jet over and pick up the victim's items. You might even remember the DND, or Do Not Disturb scam, where the scammer would get the victim to basically type their password as their away message. This actually wasn't the only way that scammers tried to get people to type their password in-game, but it boils down to this: never type your password anywhere except the login screen, and especially not to enter somebody's clan. These were almost all lowbrow scams and completely relied on a naive victim. While I think it's good to talk about them in the history of video, I want to spend our time focusing on some of the most devastating scams that could actually get the best of some of the most skeptical players and could cost the victim a lot of either in-game items or even as far as costing them their D2 account. So if you ever lost your torch in a drop trade or got tricked in the trade screen, just imagine how bad it would feel if you were the victim of one of these. The first scam we'll talk about is called the drop hack, and from there we'll also talk about other forms of file sharing that have led to some serious scams in D2 history. The drop hack was a Visual Basic Trojan program that scammers would use to steal all the items on a player's character. The scammer would convince unsuspecting players that it was anything they desired, from a map hack to a bot program. Most commonly through AOL Instant Messenger. Yeah, that's how long ago this scam took place. Through AIM, the scammer would send an executable file to the victim. The scammer would stay in-game with the victim and wait for them to open it. As soon as they did, the program would take control of the victim's D2 client and systematically drop all of their equipment on the ground. This was arguably the most prolific scam in D2 history, as it would enable the victim to become a scammer themselves. They would literally have the program that they just got scammed with on their computer and could send it to other people. Back in those days, it was almost guaranteed if anybody was sending you a file from anything, it was probably this program and you were about to get drop hacked. But file sharing wasn't a one-way street. Sometimes the victim would be convinced to send the scammer a file from their own computer. D2 Etal was one of the first commonly used bots in Diablo 2. When setting up this primitive bot, you'd be prompted to enter your password in order to get it going, and as this was the early days of programming, the bot would store that string in a file on your computer. Savvy scammers who knew where that file was located and what it was called would go to great lengths to convince victims to send that file to them. They would sometimes work for weeks befriending rich Diablo 2 players who used bots, and one day out of the blue, they would ask for help setting up their own. They'd say something like, "Hey man, my settings INI file says it's corrupted. Can you send me yours?" The unknowing victim would then send that INI file to the scammer, which contained their password, and then subsequently lose all of their accounts. This scam took a lot of work and convincing on behalf of the scammer and left the victim feeling vulnerable and betrayed. A truly devastating scam back in the early days of D2. Moving on, the next scam we'll talk about is called corpse popping. It's staggering how many people misremember what this scam actually was. It's almost like a Mandela effect of Diablo II, which is a topic that could probably warrant its own episode if I'm being honest. But more directly, many people think that corpse popping worked entirely different than it actually did. For context, when you die in Diablo 2, as many of you know, you have to go pick up your corpse in order to get all of your items back in the same game, which is probably the stupidest thing about the game. Like, literally makes zero sense. Anyways, some people think corpse popping was a duping scam that involved killing a player 16 times to max out the number of corpses that they have, telling them to put some items on, and then killing them a 17th time to take all of their gear when it drops. That probably happened, but that's not at all what corpse popping was. The real scam was devastatingly different. The whole reason we can even have 16 corpses now is because of the original corpse popping that was going on in PvP games prior to patch 1.10. Back in those days, players could only have one corpse. If you died while trying to retrieve it, any items you'd picked up along the way would drop from your character and onto the ground. So when an unsuspecting player died in the Blood Moor, the scammer would litter the player's corpse with junk items that they bought from Charcy. When trying to pick up their body, the victim would accidentally click on some of these crappy items, click on their corpse, and then hear their character say those haunting last words.
I am overburdened.
These words meant that your character picked up most of their items on the corpse, but not all of them. And since your corpse was still on the ground and you were only allowed one corpse in that patch, you can probably guess what happens if you get killed. In that crucial window, the scammer would PK the victim again, making them drop their partially equipped items and scooping them up right in front of them while they sat there, unable to do anything about it. Most of the time, the victims were completely unsuspecting, and the items tended to be very, very GG. This is why Blizzard addressed the issue. Not only did they patch it by giving players more corpses, but they also added the /no pickup command, allowing a player to completely ignore all items on the ground. Although only the items on your first corpse save upon exit, at least the biggest incentive was gone for players to pop one another. And now we get into the nasty ones. This one goes deep and has so many levels to it. Let's start from the beginning with the first scam in this sequence called item spoofing. Back in the day, there was a third-party program that people used to spoof an item into the trade window, making it appear to be there, but it actually wasn't. So the scammer would spoof their item, the victim would put all of their GGs up to trade for it, and sure enough, the spoofed item would disappear because it was never there in the first place. Item spoofing was sort of lowbrow because you could actually tell that something was weird right away. The spoofed item would just immediately be on their side of the trade screen as soon as you opened the trade window. A little suspicious if you ask me. But the real devastation from this scam came in its aftermath. The victim, obviously irate from losing all of their items, would be in a very vulnerable mental state. The scammer would then switch gears and say something like, "Hey, while I'm not going to give you your items back, I do feel bad. I'm gonna give you this program that I use so you can do it to other people." You can probably guess where this is headed. The scammer then either sent the drop hack Trojan that we talked about, or even worse, sent them the actual program that they used. This particular program was equipped with a back door. If both players had the program active and running, you could actually force the other person to click the trade button unwillingly. So the scammer would say something like, "Put all of your GGs onto the trade screen and I'll show you how to spoof them." At that point, he would force the victim to click trade and yet again take even more items from the victim. Once the forced trade piece of the item spoof hack was well known, it was actually pretty comical to see scammers trying to scam other scammers with it. The irony in this age of D2 scamming was just insane. Most computers nowadays will warn you when you're about to open a very unsafe program, such as a keylogger or a backdoor Trojan. But back in the Wild West days of computing and the internet, this scam was extremely devastating. Moving on to quite possibly the most devastating scam of all, the account recovery scam. There have been a variety of ways this has been executed throughout Diablo II history, but we're only going to touch on the most prolific and devastating way that this happened. This scam allowed someone to gain access to your Diablo II account by some devious means, and also some rather tedious ones. This scam stands out as especially disturbing because it involved the scammer abusing the account recovery feature introduced in patch 1.10. It was called double registering, and involved the scammer creating a multitude of in-game accounts with various common names and registering an email address to them. The scammer had no intent to use the account. They would wait the 90 days for the accounts they created to expire and wait for someone else to make an account with the exact same name and start using it. The scammer was aware that this had happened because they would add the accounts that they created to their friends list and keep tabs on them over the course of a few months. As soon as they felt that the time was right, or maybe gleaned some information about the types of items that that player was honing, they would initiate a password recovery, and since the scammer first created the account and registered an email to it, if the victim did not update that email, the scammer would get the email to reset the password and could initiate the process. For the record, this has been fixed by Blizzard, but this was particularly devastating because victims were completely unaware and truly didn't do anything to compromise their own security. There are other ways that the account recovery feature has been abused in the past, but those ways involve the scammer obtaining some very sensitive information from the victim, such as their CD key or personal email. Regardless, any way that the account recovery scam was abused tended to be particularly devastating to the victim.